The courtroom buzzed with a low hum, a tension so thick it clung to the air like the humidity of a summer storm. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispered to their colleagues, and watched the clock tick mercilessly forward. The faint click of heels echoed against the marble floor, every step louder than the last, as if signaling the arrival of something inevitable. Jordan Matthews stood near the back, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, eyes focused on the bench at the far end. The judge, a figure draped in black robes, was already settled, his gaze sweeping across the room as if daring anyone to challenge the authority he exuded. Jordan had seen him before Judge Cole, an imposing figure who had built his reputation on efficiency, on making swift decisions, no matter the cost. The room fell into an eerie silence as the case at hand was called. Jordan's mind, however, wasn't on the case. It wasn't on the arguments or the legal nuances being debated. Instead, it was on the injustice he had just witnessed. He had arrived late to court. It wasn't intentional, of course. Traffic had been heavier than expected, the kind of gridlock that made even the most seasoned drivers swear under their breath. Jordan had rushed out of his car, trying to make up for lost time, but it hadn't been enough. The doors of the courtroom had closed behind him with a finality that made his stomach sink. He'd barely taken his seat when Judge Cole's voice cut through the air. "Mr. Matthews," the judge said, his tone sharp, eyes narrowed. "You are late." Again. Jordan swallowed, trying to steady his breath. He knew the rule's punctuality was a reflection of respect for the court. He had always followed them. But today, the universe had conspired against him, and now he was paying the price. "I apologize, Your Honor," Jordan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There was a traffic delay on my way here." Judge Cole didn't even blink. "A delay, Mr. Matthews? Perhaps you should consider leaving earlier in the future. In this court, we don't tolerate lateness." Jordan felt the sting of the words, the weight of judgment in the air. He had seen other lawyers, white, older, walk into courtrooms, late without so much as a reprimand. But today, it felt different. Today, it was him, standing before the judge, his career on the line for something as trivial as a few minutes. The gavel slammed down, breaking the silence. $500 fine, Mr. Matthews. You'll pay the price for wasting the court's time. Jordan's breath caught in his throat. He had expected a reprimand, maybe a stern word, but this was overkill. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what had just happened. A fine for being late? A fine that would be difficult for him to pay, especially with his student loans still hanging over him. He glanced around the room, the faces of the other lawyers and defendants blurred in his peripheral vision. His gaze fell on one of the other lawyers, a man with graying hair and an expensive suit who had sauntered in 20 minutes late. The judge hadn't batted an eye, not even a word of reprimand. Jordan's heart tightened. The disparity was glaring, but it was a truth he had known for years. The system, the court, the very place meant to uphold justice, was broken. It wasn't just the fines or the reprimands, it was the way things worked, the way people like him were treated differently for no reason other than the color of their skin. He stood still, trying to control the rising tide of anger in his chest. He wanted to speak up, to call out the hypocrisy, but something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of ruining his career, the fear of being labeled an agitator, or maybe it was the gnawing sense of helplessness that had been building for years, ever since he first put on that suit and stepped into the world of law. But today, something had shifted. He would not just sit in silence. Not again. Jordan turned his attention back to the judge, his expression hardening. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a reconsideration of the fine," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. Cole's eyes narrowed, as if Jordan had just made an absurd request. "Denied," the judge snapped. But Jordan didn't back down. Not this time. The anger in him burned hotter, and he could feel it fueling something deeper, something that could no longer be ignored. He didn't know it yet, but in that moment, a spark had been lit. The path ahead would not be easy, and he didn't know how it would end. But one thing was certain. He would fight. And whatever the cost, he wasn't going to let this go. The courthouse felt colder than usual as Jordan stepped out into the hallway, his mind still spinning. The fine had hit him harder than he'd expected. It wasn't the money, it was the principle of it. He had never been one to believe in coincidence, and the way Cole had singled him out, the way his penalty seemed disproportionate, felt intentional. There was something about it, something deeper than just a late arrival, that gnawed at him. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to shake the frustration that had built up inside him. The air felt thicker now, like the walls themselves were closing in, the weight of the injustice pushing down on him. "Hey, Jordan, you good?" It was Jamal, a fellow attorney who worked in the same office building. Jamal had a way of showing up at the most unexpected moments, and today, his presence seemed like a lifeline. Jordan gave him a tight smile, but he could feel the tension in his shoulders, the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'm fine," Jordan said, but his voice betrayed him, tight and strained. He hadn't expected to share the details, but something in Jamal's eyes, something in his unspoken understanding, made him want to talk. Jamal didn't push him, just raised an eyebrow and leaned against the wall, waiting for Jordan to speak when he was ready. Finally, Jordan sighed, glancing back at the courtroom doors. "I don't know, man. Something's off today." The judge, Cole, he threw down a $500 fine just for being late. Me, of all people. But the white lawyers, they get a pass. This isn't the first time I've seen it happen, but it's like I finally noticed how bad it really is. Jamal's expression shifted, his easy smile fading into something more serious. "You've been noticing it for a while now, haven't you? It's just harder to ignore when it's you in the hot seat." Jordan nodded, the truth of Jamal's words sinking in. He had seen the little things, the dismissals, the quick judgments, the way people of color were often treated like second-class citizens in a system that was supposed to serve everyone equally. But he had always thought that if he played by the rules, worked hard enough, followed the right path, it would somehow shield him from the biases that others faced. But now the shield had cracked, and he was left exposed. "I'm not just going to let it slide, Jamal," Jordan said, his voice firm now, a sense of determination creeping in. "I've been in this game long enough to know how it works. But today, I don't think I can just keep quiet. Not anymore." Jamal's eyes narrowed, as if weighing Jordan's words, before he gave a slow nod. "You know what you're up against, right? Cole's been around forever. People like him, they don't get taken down easily." "I don't care," Jordan replied, his voice more resolute. "He's not above the law. None of them are." Jamal paused, then gave Jordan a long look, as if considering something. "Look, I get it. You want to do something about it, and you should, but you gotta be careful. You start rocking the boat too much, and people will come after you. You're gonna need more than just a fine to make a difference." Jordan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settling in. He had always prided himself on being the one who followed the rules, who took the high road. But today, that wasn't enough. The system was broken, and if he didn't do something, who would? "I'm going to dig into this," Jordan said finally, his tone unwavering. "I'm going to start asking questions. Look into how many times this has happened before. Maybe there's more to it than just one bad judge. Maybe it's the whole damn system that needs to change." Jamal gave him a serious look, then clapped him on the shoulder. "You know I've got your back. But remember, this isn't just about you and Cole. This could get a lot bigger. Be ready for it." Jordan didn't say anything at first, but the fire in his chest burned brighter now. He was ready for whatever came next. He had no idea where this path would lead, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let this go. Not this time. He turned back to the hallway, his gaze steely and determined, already thinking about how to make his next move. He would start small, gather information, piece together the truth that had been hidden for so long. Maybe it wasn't just coal. Maybe this was bigger than he had ever imagined. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to expose it all. The days following the courtroom incident felt like a blur. Jordan couldn't escape the weight of the fine, the judgment, or the harsh realization that he was just another cog in a machine that seemed designed to keep people like him in their place. Each morning, he woke up with the same gnawing feeling in his gut, the need to do something, to act. The problem was, he had no idea where to start. It wasn't until late one evening, when Jordan was sitting in his small apartment, stacked with case files and half-drunk coffee cups, that he realized what had to be done. If he wanted to make a real difference, he couldn't just focus on coal. The problem was bigger than one judge, bigger than one courtroom. It was the whole damn system. Jordan's fingers hovered over the keyboard of his laptop as he searched through public records and case files. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, but there had to be a pattern. There had to be a way to prove that the disparity he had experienced wasn't a random incident. No, it was part of something much larger, a deeper, ingrained issue that needed to be uncovered. He started with Cole's court records, reading through hundreds of cases, scanning for anything that stood out. Jordan's eyes narrowed as he scanned the names of defendants, the charges, and the sentences. Over and over again, he saw a disturbing trend. White defendants with similar offenses were receiving lenient sentences, while people of color, especially black defendants, were handed harsher penalties. It wasn't just the sentences, it was the way the cases were handled. The lack of patience, the dismissals, the quiet, almost casual way white defendants were treated. Jordan's blood began to boil as he realized the full scope of what he was seeing. But it wasn't just coal. It was something systemic. The more he dug, the more he realized that coal was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. His mind raced as he pieced the evidence together, the fragments of information falling into place, like a broken mirror, slowly being reassembled. The court system in Harrisonville had been rigged for years. This wasn't just about one bad judge. This was about a network of biases that had been built over time, ingrained into every aspect of the system. He couldn't just sit on this. He needed to act, but acting recklessly could cost him everything. He had seen it happen to people before. One wrong move, one push too far, and they were finished. It wasn't just about legal strategy. It was about survival. But Jordan wasn't the type to back down. Not anymore. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, late-night meetings, and strategy sessions with Jamal, who had reluctantly agreed to help him investigate further. Jordan knew they had to be careful. They had to gather enough evidence to make a real case, to expose the systemic corruption without putting themselves in too much danger. "All right, Jordan," Jamal said one night as they sat in a quiet coffee shop. "We've got a small window to make this happen, but we need to be smart about it. We can't just go around accusing people of racism without solid proof. You know how this goes." Jordan leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of Jamal's words. It wasn't just about proving the bias, it was about framing it in a way that the public and the court would understand. They needed to show that it wasn't just an isolated incident. This was about a broken system, one that needed to be held accountable. The two of them spent hours going over the data, cross-referencing cases, speaking to former defendants, and even interviewing court staff who had worked with Cole for years. The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a rot that ran deep within the court system itself. But it wasn't just the legal battles Jordan had to face, it was the personal ones. As he dug deeper into the case, he found himself struggling with his own doubts. Was this worth it? Was he ready to risk everything for a cause that seemed so insurmountable? Jordan knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. But every time he looked at the evidence, every time he reviewed the files, the risk became clearer. If he went public, If he exposed what he had found, there would be no going back. His career could end before it even really began. The system wasn't kind to whistleblowers. He'd seen it happen before. People who spoke up were silenced, their careers ruined, their lives upended. Still, Jordan couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency inside him. The truth needed to be out there. If he didn't fight for it, who would? And so, with a quiet resolve, Jordan made up his mind. He would take the fight to the next level. He would use every ounce of his power, his position, his voice, to challenge the system. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he would succeed or fail. But Jordan knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a bystander. He was in this fight now, and he wasn't backing down. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Jordan sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of his decision settle in. The next few weeks would determine everything. The path ahead wasn't clear, and it certainly wouldn't be easy, but it was a path he had to walk. He had no other choice. And so, he set to work. The next few days were a blur of interviews, phone calls, and late-night research. Jordan's apartment had transformed into a war room, papers and case files strewn across the floor. His laptop open to various government databases, court records, and news reports. The weight of the task ahead of him felt heavier with each passing hour, but it also fueled something deeper inside him, something that had been simmering for years, waiting for the right moment to explode. He had already reached out to a handful of former defendants who had appeared in front of Judge Cole. Each conversation had been painstakingly meticulous. He couldn't afford to miss a single detail. Each witness, each story, added another layer to the growing evidence of systemic bias within the court. He had learned that many of the defendants had been subjected to harsh sentences for minor offenses, while their white counterparts were often let off with a slap on the wrist. The more Jordan dug, the more the pattern became undeniable. But it wasn't just the sentencing that bothered him. It was the way the system seemed to operate, as though it was always stacked in favor of the powerful and the privileged. The courtrooms, the judges, the defense attorneys, they all moved like gears in a machine designed to grind down people of color, to treat them as less than, to lock them into a system that never let them out. Each story he uncovered made his blood run colder. One woman had been sentenced to 5 years for a non-violent drug offense, while a white defendant caught with a similar amount of drugs had been given probation. Another man had been locked up for a simple theft, while his white counterpart had received a fine and a warning. It was clear, in the eyes of the court, some lives were worth more than others. Jordan couldn't let this go, not when the truth was so obvious. But every time he sat down to draft his report, to begin drafting the case that would change everything, he found himself questioning everything. Was he ready for the backlash? Would the system allow him to make this kind of change, or would it crush him before he could even begin? He had seen it happen before, people who tried to expose the truth, only to have their careers destroyed, their lives turned upside down. Was he prepared to lose it all? His phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. It was Jamal. "Hey, Jordan. We've got a problem. I think someone's on to us." Jamal's voice was strained, as though he was holding something back. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What happened?" "I'm not sure, but I've been getting some strange calls. No one's saying anything, but I can feel it. People are starting to notice we're poking around. You need to be careful. If they catch wind of what we're doing, it could blow up in our faces." Jordan rubbed his temple, a headache starting to form. "Damn. I knew this was coming. What do we do now?" "We keep going. We don't stop. But we need to be smarter. I've got a friend who used to work in the DA's office. He might be able to get us some more dirt on Cole. Someone on the inside. If we can find more evidence, maybe we'll have a stronger case." Jordan's mind raced as he processed Jamal's words. It was risky, sure, but they had already crossed the point of no return. He couldn't stop now, not when he was this close to exposing everything. All right. Set it up, Jordan said, his voice steady, despite the rising tension in his chest. I'll be ready. The next few days passed in a blur. Jordan and Jamal worked in tandem, their days a mix of legal research, clandestine meetings, and quiet surveillance. The deeper they went, the more Jordan realized just how much he had underestimated the scope of the corruption. It wasn't just Cole, or even just the judges. It was a culture that had taken root within the entire court system, one that protected its own and crushed anyone who dared to challenge it. Jordan had never felt so much pressure in his life. Every phone call, every meeting felt like walking a tightrope. He had become hyper-aware of every person around him, every conversation, every glance. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. And yet, despite the fear, the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him going. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about justice, about righting a wrong that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The tipping point came one rainy afternoon when Jordan met with his inside contact, a former DA's office employee named Marcus. Marcus was jittery, glancing around the coffee shop nervously, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. "Man, you're playing a dangerous game," Marcus said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't know if you fully understand what you're getting into." Cole. He's not someone you just take down. Jordan leaned forward, his voice steady. "I don't care about Cole. This isn't just about him. This is about the whole damn system. I can't let it slide anymore." Marcus gave him a look, as though he was weighing whether to walk away or to help. Finally, he sighed and pulled out a folder from his bag, sliding it across the table toward Jordan. "All right, but you better know what you're doing. You're about to open a can of worms." Jordan opened the folder, his fingers trembling slightly as he looked at the documents inside. There were court records, transcripts, and something far more damning, emails between Cole and several other high-ranking officials, discussing ways to bypass certain laws and reduce the sentencing of white defendants, while harshening penalties for people of color. It was right there, in black and white. "This is everything we need," Jordan said, his voice low, filled with a mix of disbelief and triumph. "This will expose them. This is proof that the system isn't just broken. It's corrupt." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "You sure about this? You know they'll come after you, right? This could ruin your career. Your whole life." Jordan didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." And just like that, the pieces fell into place. Jordan had the evidence he needed. The truth was undeniable. But now, the real fight began. He had to decide how to use this information, how to expose it to the world without getting crushed in the process. He knew there would be no turning back. This was it. But Jordan was no longer afraid. He wasn't just a prosecutor. He was a man with a mission, and he would stop at nothing to see it through. Jordan woke up the next morning, feeling like a man on the edge of something both terrifying and exhilarating. The air in his small apartment felt dense, as if the weight of the decision he had made was already pressing down on him. His hands hovered over his laptop, the evidence Marcus had handed him still fresh in his mind. The emails, the transcripts, the documents that proved, beyond any doubt, that Cole and the others had been deliberately manipulating the system to perpetuate racial injustice. He had all the proof he needed, but that was only half the battle. The next step was the most dangerous one, getting the information into the right hands. Jordan had considered every possible avenue. The media, the press, a public outcry, it all seemed like a viable option, but it carried the risk of turning him into a target before he could build a strong enough case. It would be too easy for the system to dismiss him as just another disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. He needed to be strategic. He needed to be smart. Jamal had suggested going to a higher authority, someone within the state bar or a federal investigator who could look at the case objectively. It was risky, but it was also the cleanest option. The last thing Jordan wanted was for his name to become synonymous with scandal before the investigation even began. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been unfairly punished, who had been caught in a system designed to fail them. But just as Jordan was about to make a decision, his phone buzzed again. It was Jamal. "Jordan, we've got a serious problem." Jamal's voice crackled through the phone, his tone urgent. "I've been getting calls. Someone's looking into us. We need to move fast." Jordan's stomach sank. He had expected this moment to come eventually, but now that it was here, it hit him harder than he anticipated. Someone was on to them, maybe Cole, or someone in the court system, had caught wind of their investigation. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. "Shit. What do we do?" Jordan asked, his voice clipped as he ran his hand through his hair. "I think we need to go public. We have to force their hand. If we don't, they'll bury this before it even gets started. But we need to make sure we have all our ducks in a row. I've been talking to some reporters. I think we can get the story out there, but we need to make sure we have solid proof." Jordan's pulse quickened. Going public wasn't the plan. Not yet. But Jamal was right. Time was running out. If they didn't act now, they would lose their chance. The pieces were in place, and there was no turning back. He couldn't afford to wait. "All right, let's do it. Get the reporters in touch with me. I'll prepare the evidence," Jordan said, his voice steely. "This ends now." The next few hours were a whirlwind. Jordan spent the entire afternoon preparing his case, organizing the evidence, writing a statement that would expose the corruption, and drafting an email to send to the reporters Jamal had lined up. His fingers flew over the keys, every word, every sentence, loaded with the truth he had uncovered. It wasn't just about Cole. It was about the entire system, one that had failed countless people of color over the years. When the email was finally ready, Jordan took a deep breath, looking at the screen in front of him. This was it. The moment of truth. There was no going back. He hit send. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. Jordan's heart raced as he stared at the blinking cursor, waiting for the email to be confirmed as sent. When the notification popped up on the screen, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. He turned to Jamal, who was pacing nervously beside him. "It's done. They've got it. Now we wait." For the first time in days, Jordan allowed himself a moment to breathe. He wasn't sure if it was relief or dread that consumed him, but there was no time to waste. He had exposed the truth. Now, he had to wait for the storm that was about to hit. The hours ticked by, each one dragging on longer than the last. Jordan tried to keep himself busy, but the anxiety gnawed at him. What if the reporters didn't pick up the story? What if they buried it? What if the system worked faster than he anticipated and tried to silence him before the truth got out? It wasn't until late that night that he received the first message. His phone buzzed an email from one of the reporters. "We have your story. We're publishing tomorrow." Jordan's breath caught in his throat. Tomorrow. The story would be out in the public eye tomorrow. There was no turning back now. He had already risked everything: his career, his future, and now it was in the hands of the media. The next few days were a blur of media appearances, frantic phone calls, and interviews with journalists. The story had broken wide open. Headlines splashed across the front pages of local newspapers. News channels played the footage on repeat, and social media erupted with outrage. It was no longer just a case of one corrupt judge. It was a full-blown investigation into the entire Harrisonville court system. The corruption, the racial bias, the manipulation, it was all there for the world to see. But the backlash came quickly, too. The phone calls started almost immediately. Jordan's boss, the U.S. attorney, called him into his office for a meeting. He knew it was coming: the reprimands, the threats, the warning that his career was in jeopardy. It didn't matter that Jordan had exposed something so deeply entrenched in the system. The fact that he had gone public, that he had dared to challenge the court system, was enough to put him on the radar of some very powerful people. Jordan, what the hell do you think you're doing? The U.S. attorney's voice was cold, the disappointment thick in the air. You've opened up a whole can of worms. This isn't just about you anymore. You've put the entire office at risk. Jordan stood there, his arms crossed, a deep sense of resolve settling in his chest. I did what I had to do. The truth needed to be heard. His boss shot him a harsh glare. You think you can take down a system like this and walk away unscathed? You've made enemies, Jordan. You're not just up against Cole. You're up against everyone who has a stake in this. I'm not backing down, Jordan said, his voice firm. I'm not letting this go. The system is broken, and I'm not going to pretend like it's not. The U.S. attorney let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But this could ruin you. They'll bury you if they have to. Jordan didn't flinch. He had already made his decision. Then let them try. The days following the media storm were a blur of threats, protests, and rallies. People were angry, and for the first time in a long time, Jordan saw hope in their eyes. The public was behind him. The truth had come to light, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. But the fight was just beginning. The court system would retaliate, and Jordan knew that. There would be hearings, investigations, and possibly even a trial. He couldn't afford to be naive about it. This was just the first step in a battle that would change everything. Jordan was prepared for the storm. And when it came, he would be ready. The days after the media firestorm felt like a never-ending wave of pressure crashing against Jordan's every move. The courthouse was a different place now. Whispers followed him everywhere he went. People who used to greet him with casual nods now avoided his gaze. Colleagues who once respected him began to treat him with cold indifference, as though his actions had irrevocably changed the course of his career, and perhaps their own. But Jordan didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Not when the truth was finally in the open. The weight of the scandal had only fueled his resolve. He had set out to expose the rot within the system, and now that the world was watching, he had to make sure the pressure didn't fizzle out. He couldn't allow them to sweep it under the rug. There was too much at stake. The phone calls started coming in regularly now. Most of them were from journalists, some from local outlets, others from national networks desperate for interviews, for more details on the case. Jordan had become a symbol for the fight against racial bias in the judicial system, and while the attention made him uneasy, he knew it was necessary. The more people who knew the truth, the harder it would be for the powers that be to bury it. But amidst all the chaos, there was something darker beginning to stir behind the scenes. Jordan had noticed the subtle shift in the air. The more public support he garnered, the more quiet threats started to emerge. Anonymous letters in his mailbox, phone calls that were just static on the other end, veiled warnings from former colleagues. At first, he brushed it off as paranoia people who were unhappy with the media storm, or simply those who had personal stakes in the matter. But when a man in a suit approached him outside a coffee shop one afternoon, his tone polite but his eyes cold and calculating, Jordan realized just how deep the threats went. "You're making a lot of noise, Mr. Matthews," the man said, his voice smooth and detached. "You've got a lot of people talking. Some of those people, well, they don't appreciate being called out like this." Jordan's gut tightened. He didn't recognize the man, but there was no mistaking the sense of menace in his words. The man wasn't just speaking for himself. He represented something larger, something that didn't want Jordan digging any deeper. "I'm just doing my job," Jordan said, his voice level. He didn't flinch, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. "If people have a problem with the truth, they can take it up with me." The man smiled, a tight, controlled smile that sent a chill down Jordan's spine. "Oh, I'm sure they will." But don't think for a second that this is just going to go away. There are consequences for shaking up the system, Mr. Matthews. I'm sure you're starting to realize that. Before Jordan could respond, the man turned and walked away without another word, leaving Jordan standing there, staring after him, heart pounding. The meeting was a wake-up call. It wasn't just about the court system anymore. Jordan had stirred a hornet's nest, and now powerful forces were beginning to react. His life was in danger, not just his career, but his very safety. But Jordan wasn't ready to back down. He called Jamal immediately, his voice low, as he recounted the encounter. Jamal listened in silence before responding, his voice tinged with concern. "They're coming after you, Jordan. I knew this was going to escalate, but I didn't think it would happen this fast. You need to be careful. Maybe it's time we take this underground, for a while." Jordan felt a pang of doubt, but he pushed it aside. The truth was out there. It was too late to hide now. "No, we keep going. We can't let them win. I've got the people on my side. We've come too far." But Jamal wasn't so sure. "You're playing a dangerous game, man. They won't hesitate to make you disappear. You need to think about this. Are you ready to risk everything?" Jordan didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of Jamal's words pressing down on him, but the idea of retreating, of hiding away, and letting the powers that be reclaim control didn't sit right. He had already made a promise to himself, to everyone who had been hurt by the system. He couldn't stop now. "I'm not backing down," Jordan said, his voice firm. "We'll be careful, but we're not stopping. We fight until the end." Later that week, Jordan received a call from an unexpected source. It was one of the reporters who had been covering the story. Her name was Olivia, and her voice crackled with urgency. "Jordan, we've got a huge lead," Olivia said, her words rushed. "We've just received a tip-off about a meeting between Judge Cole and several city officials. They've been discussing how to suppress the investigation, how to make sure this never goes public. We need to meet, and we need to meet fast." Jordan's heart raced. This was the break they had been waiting for. If they could get their hands on concrete evidence that Cole and his allies were actively trying to derail the investigation, it would be the final nail in the coffin for the corrupt system they had been fighting. This could bring everything crashing down. "Where do we meet?" Jordan asked, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "There's a place," Olivia said, "but we need to be careful. We're dealing with some dangerous people here. If we're not careful, this could end badly." Jordan hesitated for a moment. The stakes were higher now than ever before, but he knew that this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. He couldn't pass it up. "I'll meet you there. Just tell me where." The next few hours were a whirlwind. Jordan prepared as best he could, making sure his phone was secure, that his files were encrypted. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't afford to back out now. Too many people were depending on him, too many lives had been shattered by the very system he was trying to tear down. The meeting place was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that reeked of danger the moment Jordan stepped inside. The dim light from a single hanging bulb flickered above him as he looked around, his eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice, his senses heightened. Olivia was already there, waiting by the door, her eyes scanning the room nervously. When she saw Jordan, she nodded and quickly ushered him to the back. "They're on their way," she whispered. "I've got the documents, but we need to be quick. If we don't move fast, they'll find us." Jordan nodded, his pulse quickening. They had no room for error. They were standing on the precipice of everything they had worked for, and it felt as if the ground could crumble beneath them at any moment. A car engine rumbled outside, signaling the arrival of their source. Jordan's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Moments later, a figure emerged from the darkness, and Jordan's eyes locked onto the man who would bring the final piece of the puzzle. The game was on. The warehouse was suffocating, the air thick with the scent of old wood and rust. Every creak of the floorboards beneath Jordan's feet seemed to echo louder than it should. He and Olivia stood in the shadows, their eyes flicking between the door and the small stack of papers she had brought with her. The papers were the key to everything, proof that the conspiracy ran deeper than Jordan had imagined. If they could just get the information to the right people, they could bring down the corrupt officials who had shielded Judge Cole's misconduct for years. Jordan's heart raced, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on him. His hand was clenched around his phone, ready to make the call that would start the chain reaction that could change everything. "Are you sure they'll come?" Jordan asked in a low whisper, his voice taut with anticipation. "They have to," Olivia replied, her voice equally tight. "This is bigger than any one of them. They won't risk losing everything now." But as the minutes ticked by, that nagging doubt crawled into Jordan's mind. What if it was a trap? What if the people they trusted were setting them up, luring them into the very heart of their enemy's lair? No turning back now, Jordan muttered to himself, shaking off the creeping feeling of unease. Just then, the sound of an engine growled outside the building, the deep rumble of a car pulling into the lot. Olivia stiffened beside him, and Jordan felt his pulse spike. This was it. "Stay low," Jordan ordered, his voice barely audible. He and Olivia stepped back into the shadows, hearts pounding in their chests. The car door slammed shut, followed by the rhythmic sound of boots hitting the pavement. There was no mistaking it now. Their contact had arrived. Jordan's eyes locked onto the figure who appeared at the door, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a nondescript jacket and jeans. He wasn't the source Jordan had expected, but there was no time to ask questions. They had no choice but to trust him. The man's eyes scanned the room quickly before his gaze landed on them, and without a word, he motioned for them to follow him. Jordan's mind raced as he and Olivia trailed behind the man into the heart of the warehouse. The dim light from a single hanging bulb illuminated the rusting machinery around them, creating eerie shadows on the walls. It felt like they were walking deeper into a labyrinth, and every step they took seemed to pull them further away from the safety they once had. They reached a secluded corner, where the man stopped and pulled out a small envelope from his jacket pocket. He handed it to Jordan, his face unreadable. "Everything you need is in there," he said, his voice low and flat. "You need to move fast. They'll know soon enough that you've got it." Jordan took the envelope, his fingers brushing the man's hand for just a moment. The weight of the package in his palm felt like a ticking clock. This was the evidence they had been waiting for, but it was only the first step. The hardest part was still ahead. "Thank you," Jordan said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man gave him a curt nod and started to walk away, disappearing into the darkness of the warehouse. Jordan and Olivia stood there for a moment, the silence hanging heavy between them. They had what they needed, but now the true danger was just beginning. They couldn't afford to be caught with this. If they were, it would be game over. "I don't like this," Olivia muttered, her eyes scanning the empty space around them. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jordan nodded, but his mind was already working at full speed. They had to move quickly, but they couldn't afford to slip up. The evidence in his hand could destroy everything Cole and his allies had built, but it was also a target on their backs. The two of them started walking toward the exit, trying to remain as calm as possible. But their steps grew quicker as the minutes stretched on. The door was just ahead when Jordan froze, a sound cutting through the silence. Footsteps. Too close. Someone was coming. Jordan's heart slammed in his chest. He exchanged a look with Olivia, who instantly recognized the danger. They couldn't afford to be seen. They were too exposed, too vulnerable. Without a word, they dove for cover behind a rusted machine, hearts hammering in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, growing closer to their hiding spot. Jordan's mind raced. Whoever it was couldn't see them. Not now. The figure rounded the corner, and for a moment, Jordan thought his heart would stop. It was a man in a suit, his face partially obscured by the shadows. He wasn't alone. Two other men stood behind him, all of them moving with purpose, their eyes scanning the warehouse like predators on the hunt. Jordan held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the shadows, praying that they wouldn't be noticed. The men stopped just a few feet away from where he and Olivia crouched, and Jordan felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. He could feel the heat of the men's presence, their every move a threat. For what felt like an eternity, the men lingered, discussing something in low voices that Jordan couldn't quite make out. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, the sound of it deafening in his own ears. Any wrong move, and they were done for. Then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the men turned and began walking back toward the main area of the warehouse, their voices growing fainter with each step. Jordan exhaled slowly, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the close call. "Let's go," he whispered to Olivia. "We need to get out of here. Now." With the envelope clutched tightly in his hand, Jordan led the way out of the warehouse, his mind racing. They had what they needed, but it had come at a cost. The danger was only beginning, and there was no turning back now. As they stepped into the cool night air, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The battle for justice was far from over, and now they were more exposed than ever. But the evidence in his hand was the final piece of the puzzle, and Jordan would stop at nothing to see it through to the end. The moment Jordan stepped out of the warehouse, a cold rush of wind hit his face, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside his chest. The envelope in his hand felt heavier with every step, the weight of what it contained pressing down on him. He and Olivia hurried toward the car, their footsteps quick and synchronized, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. They were being followed. Jordan kept his eyes on the shadows around them, every corner seeming to harbor potential danger. His heart raced, but he couldn't let the fear control him now. They had what they needed, and that was all that mattered. The car doors slammed shut, and Jordan immediately tossed the envelope onto the passenger seat. "We need to get this to the right people," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe here anymore." Olivia nodded, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "They're not going to stop. Not after everything we've exposed. We need to be careful. They'll be watching us." Jordan's fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, the engine's hum doing little to calm the tension coursing through his veins. "I know," he replied, his gaze fixed ahead. "But we can't stop now. Not when we're this close." The drive to their safe house felt like an eternity. Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that every car behind them was a threat, every face in the crowd a potential enemy. As they neared their destination, Olivia turned to him. "What if they come for us tonight? What if they don't let this go?" Jordan's jaw tightened. "We'll fight. This isn't just about us anymore. It's bigger than that." They pulled into the dimly lit garage of the safe house, the engine shutting off with a quiet click. Jordan stayed alert as they stepped out of the car, scanning their surroundings. Every door creaked open, like it was the start of something irreversible. They were running out of time. Inside the house, they quickly locked the doors and took the envelope into the back room. Jordan laid the papers out on the table, his eyes scanning each document with growing disbelief. The evidence was more damning than he had imagined: corrupt officials, bribes, cover-ups, and at the center of it all, Judge Cole. As he read through the papers, a sense of resolve settled over him. This was it, the proof they needed to expose everything. But even as he felt the weight of their success, a voice in his head warned him, this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. "Tomorrow, we go public," Jordan said, his voice firm. Olivia hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. "Are you sure? We're exposing everything. There's no going back after this." Jordan met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "It's already too late. They know we have it, and if we don't act fast, they'll make sure it disappears." With a nod, Olivia grabbed her phone, ready to start the process of contacting the right people. As she dialed, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that the forces they were up against were already making their move. The game was changing, and they were about to be in the thick of it. Before he could even process what was happening, a sharp knock on the door shattered the quiet. Jordan's heart stopped. His eyes met Olivia's, the same unspoken question, passing between them. Were they already here? "Stay calm," he whispered. The knock came again, this time louder. Someone was outside, and they weren't here for small talk. Jordan's pulse quickened. This was it. The line between safety and danger had been crossed. The battle wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore, it was about surviving it. The knock at the door echoed through the silent room, louder this time. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging as the seconds stretched long. Olivia's eyes widened with panic, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone. But Jordan held up a hand to stop her. "Stay calm," he whispered again, though the words felt hollow in the tense air. They weren't sure who was out there, but they knew it wasn't someone looking for a friendly conversation. His mind raced. They had to act fast if the documents in his hand reached the wrong people. Everything they had worked for would be destroyed in an instant. If this was the authorities coming to collect them, it meant one thing: the game was over. Another knock, this time harder, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots on the porch. Jordan knew they were running out of time. He glanced around the room, searching for an escape route. The windows were too small to climb through, and the back door would be easily seen from the alley. The only option left was to face whoever was at the door head on. "Ready?" Jordan's voice was steady, but inside, he was a storm. Olivia nodded, though the fear in her eyes was clear. "I'll go first," Jordan said. He grabbed the envelope and tucked it into his jacket, his fingers brushing the edge of the papers. They couldn't afford to let anyone see them. With a deep breath, he moved to the door, each step heavy. He didn't know who it was, but whoever it was had come for him. The door creaked as he slowly turned the knob, knowing that whatever lay on the other side could change everything. When the door swung open, Jordan found himself face to face with a man in a dark suit, his expression cold and calculating. Behind him stood two others, equally as imposing. But it was the man at the front who spoke. "You're in way over your head, Matthews," the man said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "We know you have the documents, and we know you've been digging where you shouldn't." Jordan's grip tightened on the doorframe, his breath steady despite the storm raging inside. "If you think I'm backing down, you've got another thing coming," he said, his voice low but unwavering. The words felt almost too easy to say, but they were the only thing keeping him grounded. The man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you give someone right before you pull the rug out from under them. "You're not in control here, Matthews," the man said. "You think you're the hero in this story, but you're just a pawn." Jordan stood tall, refusing to show weakness. "If I'm a pawn, then I'll fight until the game's over." The man's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He took a step forward, blocking the door. Jordan didn't flinch. "Here's what's going to happen," the man said, his tone turning colder. "You hand over the documents, and we'll forget this little encounter ever happened. You keep them, and things are going to get unpleasant for both you and your little friend." Jordan's eyes flicked to Olivia, standing a few feet behind him. She was trying to appear calm, but he could see the fear in her eyes too. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. "I'm not afraid of you," Jordan said, his voice tight with determination. He didn't have the luxury of fear anymore. This was bigger than him. It was bigger than all of them. The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this. Mark my words." But Jordan wasn't listening anymore. He could hear the weight of the situation, feel the danger that hovered around them. But he also knew this was the moment everything had been leading up to. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. "I'm not backing down," Jordan repeated, his voice steady now. "And neither should you." There was a long silence, broken only by the soft sound of Olivia's breath behind him. The man in the suit seemed to weigh his words, but finally, he nodded, stepping back with a dismissive wave of his hand. Fine. Keep the documents. But remember this, you'll never be safe. Not anymore. Jordan didn't flinch, as the man turned on his heel and walked away. The two others followed, their footsteps echoing in the distance. Jordan stood there for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. He turned to Olivia, who was looking at him with a mix of relief and apprehension. "What now?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Jordan didn't hesitate. "Now we go public. We've got everything we need to take down the system." But as he spoke, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The battle was far from over, and now, with the documents in hand, they were about to become the most dangerous people in the city. They couldn't rest, not yet. The real fight was just beginning. As they headed toward the door, Jordan could feel the weight of the future on his shoulders. There would be no turning back from here. But that was exactly what he had wanted from the start, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. And now the world would know.